yes, we did celebrate our 30th anniversary on Wednesday. We're having a free weekend celebrations this weekend, including this show, and Alex will be speaking to the public tomorrow here at the museum. So a lot of things going on to celebrate the 30th anniversary. But this museum has always been part of Terre Haute and part of the Wabash Valley, and it goes to Eva Kor's, forethought to open a museum. This is the first and only Holocaust museum in the state of Indiana, and for it to be here in Terre Haute is a remarkable feat and still going strong even after her passing, almost coming up on 6 years ago.
Just to talk about the museum a little bit, I look around here, I'm looking around here, and there are several things that I want to check out much more closely before I leave to head back to Bloomington. But what are a couple of key exhibits or key things, Troy, that you think that people would find interesting here?
Well, I think one of the most things that they find interesting, obviously, is Eva's story.
Yeah.
And that is, one that is full of hope and empowerment and forgiveness being a big topic that she had. But so just learning her story and kind of putting, the Holocaust can be a very difficult topic, and it can very, it's hard to talk about and to learn about. But we kind of, here at this museum, we're unique in that we talk about Eva's story. We kind of make it into a human story. And we also talk about, Alex's father, Mickey Kor. We tell his story. And another local survivor, Walter Sommers. We tell their stories and make it kind of humanize it. But one of the best things in our museum is our theater. It's an interactive theater. It's called Dimensions and Testimony. It's where you can actually ask questions to a Holocaust survivor. In most cases, we have Eva Kor up. I have to tell the students it's not AI. It's not a deep fake. It's actually her answering a question. And so there's over 1,000 questions you can ask her. And it's a really cool interactive experience for not just students that come through here. We get about 3,000 to 4,000 students that come through on a yearly basis here at the museum. But it's really cool experience for the general public to come in and really have a chance to have a conversation with the Holocaust survivor.
Mm-hmm. Alex, what do you gravitate toward when you come here to the museum?
Well, when I think back to 30 years ago, and I was actually the MC for the event when we opened. And then, 8 years later, some people know the museum was burned down by an arsonist, and then my mom and others helped to rebuild it. My first thought is just I am flattered that this is still here. Growing up here, I never dreamed that my parents would have this as a legacy. And so typically what I gravitate for is I go to the theater and talk to my mom. And so, it's when the hologram was created, my mom used to have arguments with herself. She was still alive. And so that's a big part for me. But, just recently with the closing of the Indiana Historical Society exhibit, we have a lot of their different things that we have now, and so it's really added to the museum. It's beautiful. I would encourage, if nothing else, for people to come from Bloomington, from throughout the state of Indiana and Midwest to come and visit. But I would say, the theater is what I really...
And Bob, let me just say, I've heard Alex talk to his mom in the theater, and it is initially a very odd experience to hear him asking a question to his mom. But when you think about it, and think about the can you imagine if it would be to be able to talk to your grandparents, to have a conversation with your parents or with your grandparents years from now, and just the technology that has allowed that to happen, and that experience when you watch Alex ask his mom questions, it's really powerful, and just what the whole experience is supposed to be about.
One other thing, Bob, to answer your question, I think when the museum was burned down, there were pennies that kids had collected to commemorate the numbers of people, and we used to have burned pennies that signified showed what happened when hate, unfortunately, created this terrible problem here. So that's also something I remember and looked always to see.
Mm-hmm. So I want to ask you, Alex, about growing up with your mother and father, both survivors of the Holocaust. What are some key things you remember about that? Because, of course, history teaches about the Holocaust. It was a horrific time, and your mother and father both had to live through it in a very, very personal way. What was it like growing up with them as parents?
Unique. My parents, more my mom than my father, would tell my sister and I very age-appropriate items. All our questions are always answered. And just to give you two examples that I think would capture what you're asking. When I was 7 years old, my sister's 5, and our next-door neighbor is not Jewish. They had a daughter my sister's age. And just real quick, my sister and I, when my mom would make us dinner or do the dishes, we would always see her Auschwitz number on the left forearm. So after dinner, my sister's next door, and the lady who still lives here is doing dishes, and she says, "Mrs. Smith, how come you don't have a number like my mommy does?" And Mrs. Smith said, "Well, you need to go ask your mom that." Okay, so run next door. Mommy, I'm over at Jill's house, and Mrs. Smith doesn't have a number like you. I thought all mommies have numbers. My mom, I think most parents, 5-year-old daughter would say, "You're too young." My mom said, "No, Rena, remember, your father and I told you and your brother that bad people did bad things to us, and one of those bad things was they put a number on my arm." Oh, and Mrs. Smith, she didn't have those bad things. So we were told very age-appropriate things so that we would have a good understanding. And one other quick example, when I was 12 or 13, typical peer pressure, I'd like to have the nicest tennis racket, or the nicest shirt. And I think, maybe it wasn't Gucci, I think it was Hang 10, and all my friends had Hang 10 shirts. And I said, "Mommy, Daddy, how come I want to get a Hang 10 shirt? Because Mike and Eric have Hang 10 shirts." And my dad looked at my closet and said, "Alex, you have 6 shirts. When I was your age, I didn't have one." Mm-hmm. And it was very tough love, but it was, at the time I didn't like the answer. But, for me, it was a life lesson that I learned and I always remember.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think a lot of what both of you've already said this, but a lot of what your mother tried to do was in the museum is talk about forgiveness and compassion and a lot of those things. But I think we have to go back to those dark days, and just to make sure that people understand, what it was like for your mother, her twin sister, Miriam, right?
Right.
They went through these Mengele experiments,
right?
What? Tell us more about that.
There were 3,000 twins, 1,500 sets of 2, ages 3 to 13. 1943 and 44, Mengele, when people would come off the cattle car on their way to the gas chamber, if they were children, most of the time children were sent immediately to the gas chamber. But if there were twins, they would be saved. And if my mom wasn't a twin, I wouldn't be here because she would not have lived. And so these experiments were, one was a guinea pig, one was a control. If one twin died, they would kill the other and do comparative autopsies. So my mom and my aunt got to Auschwitz in May of 44, and the experiment started 4, 5, 6 days a week. They would sit in the lab, blood drawn, blood injected, boys and girls typically naked, very embarrassing. This is how life was from May of 44 pretty much through December of 44. A lot of people ask what was the purpose of the experiments. If you talk to any of the twins, and I've probably over the years met about 100 of them, they would all tell you to a person it was they knew that they were being used to develop fertility drugs to perpetuate the German race. If you ask experts now, and I'm just a podiatrist, I'm not a geneticist, you would say that probably you would need to test the mothers rather than the children themselves. But nonetheless, they knew they were being used in experiments. And so by December, the experiments stopped. And then over the years, more and more information has come out. There's a book out by David Marwell that talks about the experiments. But most twins, by the time they were in the 1980s, started having health problems. And then usually kidney or liver. And my aunt ended up having, 1987, my mom donated one of her kidneys. When they took the kidney out of my aunt's body, it had not developed beyond the age of 10.
Mm. So I think here at the museum you have a display about those.
We do, yeah. It's part of what we obviously talk about, again, being Eva's story and talking about the twins. We are the only museum in the world that really focuses on the Mengele twins. Thanks to Eva and Miriam and those on the candles board 30 years ago, we were able to find, the organization was able to find 122 either twins or one or two of the twins that were still alive out of those, as Alex mentioned, the 3,000 that kind of went through Auschwitz. And so the goal of candles kind of was what Alex just said. It started by the doctors doing a kidney, transplant, Eva donating a kidney to Miriam, and the doctors saying, your kidney, Miriam, didn't grow past the age of 10. And maybe if we could find the records of Dr. Mengele or find other twins, we might be able to help. Might be able to see what happened when you were 10 years old. And so that's kind of what started the quest of candles, was to find other twins and find those experiments, which unfortunately they've never been able to find the records of those experiments. And then, like I said, the organization was able to contact and have contact with about 122 twins that survived.
We have from the Auschwitz State Museum names with my mom's name and aunt's names, and I even have seen things where blood drawn, blood taken out. On the famous liberation picture, which is here, the only two Mengele twins that I know are still alive as a pair are behind my aunt with the hoodies on. I think they're scarves, but they are the Changara twins. But I believe there's maybe 20, 25 twins still alive, but they are the only set of pair that are still alive, and they live in Israel.
One thing I learned before this show, I didn't know what candle stood for. And now I'm going to read it because it's kind of long, but it says Children of Auschwitz Nazi Deadly Lab Experiments Survivors. So that's candles actually is an acronym for that, that was fascinating to me.
It is, and it's fascinating the number of spam emails I get, Bob, that ask if we make bulk candles here, if we can supply some vanilla candles. We do sell a couple different candles, but we do not make candles here.
All right, we have a question from the audience. Which aspect of the Holocaust do you feel isn't taught enough these days?
I'll
yeah,
take
go
it.
for it, Alex.
Great question. If my mom were here, she would tell you that the biggest aspect about the Holocaust and Holocaust education in an effort to mitigate anti-Semitism and hate is the fact that children under the age of 12 or 13 are not exposed to the Holocaust. And my mom was very, very, particularly late in life, focused on trying to figure out a way to talk to younger kids, maybe not talking about the gruesome experiments, but to give them some exposure, because her thought was by the time kids get to high school, and for sure by the time they get to college, their minds are already made up. They think they know everything. If you get to kids that are maybe 4th and 5th and 6th grade and at least expose them to some part of the Holocaust or just basic ideas about hate and anti-Semitism and respecting your fellow classmate, she would be quite pleased if we all did that more. And one quick point, one time my mom was lecturing to 10-year-olds, and the 10-year-old said, "Mrs. Kor, who taught you to survive Auschwitz?" Typical 10-year-old question. So my mom was a quick thinker, and she got in the kid's face, and he took a step back. And my mom said, "Why'd you take a step back?" "Well, you got too close to me." And my mom said, "That's how I survived Auschwitz," meaning it was a knee-jerk response. There was nothing taught to her. She just kind of went by the seat of her pants and every day trying to figure out a way to survive. But great question.
So your mom lost 119 family members. Your dad lost over 80 relatives during the Holocaust. How are you honoring them these days?
Well, as I tell many people, I'm a full-time podiatrist. 6, 7, 8 years ago, I didn't think I would be this. I wouldn't be speaking like I do and talking. But how am I honoring my parents? A couple thoughts. One is, as you mentioned, I have a book. The Candles Holocaust Museum allows me the forum to continue to speak and talk. Going back to what I said, I didn't think I'd be doing this. 2 days before my mom died, we were in our hotel room during our trip to Auschwitz, and I said, "Mom, she was playing on her social media. I said, "Mom, you're 85 years old, at what point are you going to slow down?" And she says, "Slow down? What do you mean?" "Alex, unfortunately, I can't slow down. There's too much hate, too much anti-Semitism, too much bigotry and racism in the world. Unfortunately, my work is needed more than ever." I never had that conversation with my mom to say what my role should be. So I always think back to that conversation on July the 2nd, because 2 days later she died in the hotel room, July 4th, 2019. So I hope, I think none of us involved in Holocaust education, we all understand that it does not entirely mitigate or stop hate and anti-Semitism, but I think it's a good start. And I think what Troy and the staff do here are amazing. I'm quite frankly flattered that this is happening, because when I was a little kid here in Terre Haute, as we talked earlier, people made fun of my parents, and now for things to come full circle is just, I sometimes pinch myself.
Troy, you've been an educator, and so I want to ask you that same question that Alex just answered, so well about Holocaust education. I mean, what's your feeling about it? What needs to be done more, or are we doing really well with that in our schools today?
We're fortunate that in the state of Indiana there is a mandate that we teach the Holocaust, but unfortunately it's not as what I say. It doesn't have a lot of teeth to it. It's currently the way it reads, and Eva was a big proponent to get this going. And some Terre Haute legislators got it going into the state legislature years ago. But it reads that you have to teach the Holocaust in 2 classes, in U.S. history and world history. And that's it. It doesn't say for how long. It doesn't say what specific curriculum on the Holocaust you have to teach about. But we see here at the museum a lot of middle school students coming, and they've read Anne Frank, or they've read Eva's book, or they've heard about Eva from their middle school English classes. I would like to see, and again, there's nothing wrong with any of that, but I would like to see some further legislation that would require the Holocaust to be taught at the younger age, as Alex mentioned. To be taught at that middle school level would be nice. But it takes a teacher that is willing to talk about the Holocaust, and again, the way the mandate reads, a teacher could, so to speak. But luckily, in the state of Indiana, we have a lot of teachers who are passionate about the Holocaust and time on it, willing to take field trips here to our museum to learn more about it. And so those are the kind of people you need. The answer to your question is I would love to see it taught at an earlier level, at that middle school level. But we are fortunate that it's even in the mandate itself here in the state of Indiana.
I spent a lot of time in Bloomington, as you know. Jeff Rudkin is a teacher at one of the middle schools in Bloomington, and he has taken his students. He took them with your mom to where? To Auschwitz, I guess?
Multiple times.
Yeah.
Multiple times. What's the impact of a trip like that, do you think, on middle school students?
Let me answer that first, Alex, and say that's a big part of what Candles does now. Thanks to Eva Kor, going back to Auschwitz, starting in the late 80s and going almost every year. Candles, as an organization, we have over 1,200 people have traveled with Candles, and we still continue that today. We took a couple years off due to COVID, but even in January of this year, Mr. Rudkin took his class with us to celebrate the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, and so to see that impact that those trips have, we have a sold out trip again this summer, and we plan another one next summer. So it's to continue that, but to see that firsthand of those middle school students and even the adults that come, and just you can see and talk about Auschwitz in pictures and read about it, but to actually go there and see it for your own eyes, it really is very impactful.
Yeah, I would echo the sentiments. Obviously, Jeff Rudkin's brought kids. We also have a pipeline to Montana, and last summer we had, there were 20 high school kids, and it's amazing how these kids, we usually after a couple days we have a nightly session where we have reflections, and how they see what they see at Auschwitz, and then how does that impact them when they go home. And one of the questions we always ask is, what are you going to say about your trip? Did you have a good time? And they always wrestle with the idea, is it a good time? One short story, I was giving a lecture Thursday night at Miriam University College of Osteopathic Medicine to all young doctors. And not that this is related to the trip, but one of the student doctors who's a really bright guy, he goes, "Are you related to Eva Kor?" I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Well, I went to Candles Museum when I was 14 years old, changed my life."
Mm-hmm.
So
How do those visits for both of you, visits to Auschwitz, how do they change you?
Well, I've been fortunate to go 3 times, and it really is, it does change the way you look at life, and to realize how blessed we are, uh, just to be able as a human, and how again Eva's mentions of being kind and forgiveness and those types of values that the represents candles. You really kind of get those things when you go to Auschwitz. Obviously, I didn't have the pleasure of going with Eva Kor, but just going today, it's incredibly impactful just for myself. And now that I've been there 3 times, as I mentioned, to go and to see it through other eyes for the very first time is it impacts people differently, obviously, but it's very impactful for everybody.
yeah, I've been. I think this past January was my 30th time. I went back the first time in 1985. So, over a period of time, the first time I went, I didn't have textbooks when I was growing up here about the Holocaust. My parents were my textbooks. And the weird thing in 1985, I knew where everything was. I knew where the selection platform was. I knew where my mom's barracks was. So over the years and seeing so many people come with us, some of the stories, one of the stories I always tell is that normally we would do this, light a candle. We have a ceremony and we would light a candle. And we still do that now at the memorial, and usually we ask if people want to say something in somebody's memory, and you never know what people are going to say. And this one, he was a high school teacher in Chicago. He had these little bands of strings around his arm, and I didn't know what it was. He was a lacrosse coach. Well, when he said, "I light the candle," the strings were from 2 players that had died in a car accident. And so he lit the candles in their memory. Mm-hmm. So it was you never know what the response is going to be and how this affects people. But I do know that people that have gone and I keep in contact with, they said it changed their life and it changes how they interact with people. A lot of times, if talk about forgiveness, they'll tell me they learned how to forgive a family member, a coworker, mainly because we went on this trip to Auschwitz.
So I want to ask you, it's a follow-up, and I'm not, I'm never sure how good my questions are, but this one I'm really not sure about. People go on a vacation with their parents, or they go back to their college campus, and, mom says, well, here's the dorm, and here's where I had my first date, and here's this. You're at Auschwitz, and your mom is showing you various parts of her life. What was the impact on you the first time?
The first time was awe and appreciation and the sense that I'm lucky to be alive, and knowing that. And then over the years, I would learn more and more, but it wasn't like going to somebody's college campus, but it was more the fact that I was very lucky to have 2 parents like that. And it's now it's a lot different because I go without her, but I always think she's kind of with me. But it's been a unique transition to go when I didn't know much, and then gradually, toward the end of her life, I would just go try to keep my mom out of trouble because she would like to get in trouble, and I can tell
good
some
trouble.
interesting, good trouble. Yeah, good trouble. One time she decided the last day she was bored in the hotel, so she wanted to clean the bathroom at this nice 5-star hotel. Mm-hmm. So she fell and hit her hand. It was a mess.
We're talking with Alex Kor and Troy Fears today. We're at the Candles Museum in Terre Haute. It's a museum that is dedicated to prevent prejudice and hatred through education about the Holocaust. If you have questions or comments for us, you can give us you can send us your questions to news@indianapublicmedia.org, or you can find us on X as well. We have a question that's come in from Charlie Matson. It says, what would Eva say about the way the administration is doing mass deportations when many of the folks arrested by ICE came to the U.S. to escape harm?
Great question. I get this periodically. I think back to what would have happened if the administration had that policy when my parents came here, and I don't know that I would be here. So without getting political, I think my mom would always stand up for people's human rights. And I think, regardless of politics, she would see and say, look, there were so many people like her that came over here after World War II, and if the same policy existed then as does now, so many people would have not become Americans and lived in the land of the free, home of the brave. So I think she would be against that type of policy and try to, for human rights, she would want all people to have an opportunity like she did.
Okay. Here's a question that I'm going to give to Troy. It's about education and how you teach, and it's about how focusing on individual stories like Eva's here at the museum, how would you say that impacts the way you can teach about the Holocaust?
Well, it impacts it a lot because when you can narrow it down, when we talk to students who come into the museum and we say, 6 million Jews were murdered at the Holocaust, they can't necessarily understand what 6 million is. It's hard for anybody to really know what that is. And we tell them, that the state of Indiana has just over 6 million people in the state. So if you can imagine the whole state of Indiana being wiped out just because they believe something that you may not. Again, that's still hard for them to comprehend, but when you can narrow it down and tell the stories, and there are obviously over 6 million stories that you can tell, but we are fortunate to be able to tell Eva's story and Mickey and Walter's and a few others here, but when you can tell it into that human element that that they can get, that they can understand that, okay, this could have been my great grandparents or what have you. Indiana does not have, and even Terre Haute doesn't have a large Jewish population, but and the students who come in here, obviously the vast majority are not Jewish by any means. Nobody that works in the museum is Jewish, and so it's not about that. It's about treating people with respect and kindness, and it's about that human element. And so we try to break it down into that, and students can relate to that.
Would you talk a little bit about your father, Mickey Kor? Because he's, Eva, your mother was kind of larger than life. She was not very big, but she was larger than life. And she is the person that gets written about the most. And your father, as I understand it, really didn't want to be identified as a survivor for a long time.
For a long time, yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bob. Mm-hmm. So my father would, when I was younger, would say, well, I played ping pong against the Nazis. He would make all kind of jokes. And then as we got older, we realized particularly that, he did have an interesting story. And my father, once my mom opened up the museum, she was still selling real estate. And she said, Mickey, look, you just retired as a pharmacist. 2 days a week, I need you to work here. I don't tell my story. Then about 2 years later, there was a sports writer who was a substitute teacher. And so they bring a class here, and my mom was supposed to be here, and my mom had a sales call. And so my dad was here, and the teacher, Mike, said, well, is Eva here? Oh, no, she's not here. Oh, these kids have been reading about her. They want to learn. And so my dad said, Mike, I'm actually a survivor. What do you mean you're a survivor? So he gave his first lecture. And as I can tell the story, when the American GIs freed my father on April 15th, 1945, which ironically is my birthday, years later, but they gave him a Coca-Cola. And my dad, they asked him, how's it feel to be free? He knew the word free. And so my dad always associated freedom with Coca-Cola, and that's why you see Coca-Cola bottles here.
Oh, yeah.
And so that first time he gave the lecture, he told the Coca-Cola story. So those kids came back a couple weeks later with his Coca-Cola with all kind of messages, perseverance and love and compassion and freedom. And when the museum was burned down years later, those kids now in their 20s, maybe early 30s, came back with a new six-pack of Coke with those same messages. But now my father's stories, he was liberated by Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Neff. The grandchildren of the Neff still live here in Terre Haute. So my dad's story is more about Terre Haute, Indiana, than really my mom's story. And one other little anecdotal story, when he told the lecture that first time, my dad was a big Purdue fan. And he said, look, if the Nazis had won and I wouldn't be here, there'd be one more open seat at Mackey Arena because he had season tickets.
Okay.
Just to add to the Coke story, I think it's such a small world that, so in April of 1945, when Mickey gets handed that bottle of Coke, it's a bottle of Coke, and the Coke bottle was founded here in Terre Haute. That contour-shaped bottle was made just down the road from where we're at right now at the Root Glass Company. So Terre Haute celebrates the Coke bottle. We have a 6-foot-tall Coke bottle painted outside of the museum. It was part of the Chamber of Commerce program a few years ago, but the one we have is painted in honor of Mickey, obviously. But just to think about that, the Coke bottle was invented here in Terre Haute, and that a bottle of Coke was given to Mickey Kor, in 1945, and he ends up here in Terre Haute. And correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, but ended up drinking Coke the rest of his life because of that.
Throughout my dad's when I was a little kid, I didn't know what Pepsi was. We had Coca-Cola breakfast, lunch, and dinner. My dad's last days, he had Coca-Cola everywhere.
So Walter Summers is another name that's very instrumental in the museum. There's a library that's named after him. So what's his story?
I'll let you go, Alex. You knew Walter more than I did.
Yeah, Walter came here. He was a German Jew, and he was, when Kristallnacht happened, he was in Germany. He was not in a camp, but he's a Holocaust survivor, and so came here and was in the clothing business, merchant, and really his story is just very typical of German Jews that were lucky enough to leave, but no, he unfortunately passed away about right, I think, before my dad and after my mom. And
at the age of 101.
Yeah, I was going to say 101. Yeah, and he was still giving, very productive and helpful in his late 90s. So, yeah, I mean, it's nice to have. I mean, you never would think Terre Haute, Indiana has 3 Holocaust survivors. But, and I remember when I was younger, his store was downtown. I remember going to the store, and my mom would tell me he's a survivor too. So I was a little kid then.
And what about the library? Can you tell us, Troy, can you tell us about the library and what's in there, what people would find?
Well, they're going to find about 1,500 books in that library, actually physical copies of books, and students are always amazed at that. Bob,
unique concept.
Yeah, it is. But it's a free library. They are all Holocaust-related books that people can check out, just like a normal going to a public library. Obviously we would love to see more people take advantage of it, but we do have some college students that will come in and do some research, check out some books, and we have, like I said, 1,500 copies. Alex, I think, has read all of them. We even had Alex Kor's book in there, which is nice. But it's a great place, and it's something that's needed now, I think, more than ever. And obviously, we would love for it to get used more than it does currently. But it's a great place, and Walter gave money for that library, and so we have a little. We're happy to honor him in that library. You can read more about his incredible life that he led, and also check out some books while you're there.
The Candles Museum, your organization provides a lot of educational resources. And when I was looking at your website, I was really struck by there's a Pyramid of Hate unit for schools to look at. Can you talk about that Pyramid of Hate? It looked like a step-by-step to where we got in the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned and asked the question earlier about teaching of the Holocaust, and I think that's part that we don't teach about enough is how did we get there? How did this? It wasn't just an overnight thing. Auschwitz didn't happen overnight. It didn't drop from the sky. It's a quote that somebody had said before, and same thing with the Holocaust. And so we talk about that. There's I think 22, 25 museums across the country, Bob, Holocaust museums. A lot of states have Holocaust, memorial or a plaque or something, but not every state has a museum. And we are fortunate, though, to be part of an organization that is able to share resources and talk about the best practices to teaching of the Holocaust. And so much is, again, it's not just the Holocaust, but it is teaching of that hate and what led up to the Holocaust, but, how specifically today and after the effects of October 7th, that hate, the hatred that is still in this country and across the world. Anti-Semitism has grown every year across the world, and so it's just to talk again. You talk about the middle school, even the elementary school level. You kind of take it to their level as to what is hate and how can we, not have that, and can we work around that? And so, what are the elements of hate? And so that's kind of what we talk about, and that's what teachers want. They want lesson plans on that are age appropriate, that can help kids. Again, they may not understand the 6 million or the definition of the Holocaust, but they understand what hate is.
And to that point, when I talk to kids, 5th, 6th, and 7th graders, I do stress that, words matter. When words start turning into action, we end up with terrible consequences like October 7th or the Holocaust. And I think kids can relate to hate. Oh, yeah, Jimmy, he hates me, or I hate that teacher. But I think that kids understand now. When I was in 5th and 6th grade, I wasn't as bright as the 5th and 6th graders now. But I do think it's important that we try to make that effort to teach younger kids. One other thing, the concept of 6 million is always difficult to understand. Back in the 90s, my mom was lecturing real quick at a middle school in Champaign-Urbana, and the teacher started collecting pop-top tabs because the kids were in preparation for my mom to come and lecture. They collected 11 million pop-top tabs, 6 million for Jews that were killed, 5 million for non-Jews who were killed, and it ended up creating a sculpture called the Wings of Remembrance. And this was all at a middle school in Champaign. And I think the kids understood because they saw it. I remember the assembly, there were bags and bags and bags of these pop-top tabs totaling 11 million. And so they understood the concept.
It seems to me that the way things are going these days, and I don't want to get political about this either, but these concepts that you're teaching here, talk about the concept, a Hebrew expression meaning to repair the world, trying to repair the world. We are living in a very divided world. There is a lot of hate these days. I don't think anybody can deny that. You've got this list of items that you're trying to focus on: hope, healing, respect, responsibility, forgiveness, education, empathy, remembrance, inspiration, compassion, peace, and acceptance. So how successful do you think you're being? That's not a good question, but just talk about those 12 items and why they're so important to you and to your mother.
One of the things that is on that list is empathy, and I'm a podiatrist, and I do lecture to doctors and students, and there is a greater emphasis by the American Medical Association and other medical organizations, because as doctors get training, they sometimes lose that empathy for the patient. They see X number of patients, and I see X number of patients, but now there's more and more of an emphasis to talk about the Holocaust, to see what. There was an exhibit by the U.S. Holocaust Museum years ago when medicine went mad, and to use the terrible history of the Holocaust to make sure that young medical students, young doctors understand they still need to be empathetic to their patients. And my mom would commonly say when she lectured to doctors, the moment you start treating your patient like a number rather than a person, you start heading in the direction of Nazi medicine. So for me, empathy is more pertinent in my life toward patients that I see, and trying to make sure that patients, that I understand where they're coming from and that they understand how I can make them better.
Troy, where do you see some of these different elements coming out here in the museum when you're working with people who come in here to visit and just in general?
Sure. We mainly see it again in telling of Eva's story, and we talked earlier about how the Holocaust can be. It's a dark topic, right? But Eva's story is one of that hope and empathy and perseverance. And so she wanted the people to leave this museum, I think, with hope in their hearts, with those messages of doing something kind for somebody else. And that's why we recently, a couple of years ago, put in a mural right outside the front doors of the museum that is a flower garden. and it's called Eva's Peace Garden, and we actually have those words that you mentioned, Bob, hidden in the mural. But we wanted people to be able to walk out of the museum and see something beautiful like this mural of a flower garden, because we don't have actual space for a flower garden, so we had to go with a mural instead. But it just, again, to kind of put a smile on their face and let them know that there is hope in this world, that even though the Holocaust, again, is a horrendous topic to talk about and can be painful for many people to talk about, Eva's story was not that. And it's one that we want, again, people to leave, especially students, but all people who visit this museum, to know that, again, there can be hope in the heart, respect for one another, and even doing something little can go a long way.
One other thing Troy mentioned is perseverance. And when I talk about my parents' story, one of the things that I'm not shy about is 1987, I was diagnosed with cancer, and I thought I was going to die. And my mom kept on calling me. I was living in Chicago, and finally the voicemail came through. I didn't delete it. And she said, look, I know you're there. Quit feeling sorry for yourself. Your dad's a survivor. I'm a survivor. You're going to be a survivor. This is your Auschwitz. So when I tell these stories, I think that, a lot of people, we always know that, the old adage, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I think people can identify with overcoming obstacles, overcoming adversity. And my parents' adversity is a lot different, hopefully, than what other people nowadays have to overcome. But I think it's always a testament and a good example for people to say, look, yeah, my life's not good. My parents aren't nice to me, but I'm going to overcome this. I can. If even Mickey Kor and Walter Summers can do it, I can do it.
Well, how do they feel? I mean, can you go back to 2003, the arson at the museum? How could they just bounce back from that? Was that difficult?
Yeah, it wasn't easy. So I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time, and no, my mom was heartbroken. But she had this incredible ability just to pick herself off the mat, say, okay, this happened. I'm going to make a negative into a positive. And that was really how she went about every day of her life, trying to make a negative into a positive. And my dad obviously let her take the lead, but he was right there with her. I can remember when they, Doug had a restarting of the new building of the museum, that he was right there. So I think it goes, they were survivors. And I think this was just another example, another hurdle for them to rebuild a museum. And my mom was adamant that she didn't want to build it anywhere else. She wanted it right here, because if she would have taken it somewhere else, the arsonists had won. And she wanted to be an example to show people, no, we're going to build it right here, which we obviously have.
And it's, I mentioned this earlier in the week, that it's a testament to Indiana and Terre Haute and the Wabash Valley, and that, they were able to rebuild after the fire in 2003. It's still a very small museum. It's a small organization led by some very dedicated people. We are a nonprofit, but we were able to survive COVID. We were able to survive the passing of Eva, almost 6 years ago now. And so it just kind of shows to the kind-heartedness of Hoosiers in general, that we were able, and then the organization has been able to survive these type of things.
I need to ask about funding for the museum. Does it come all from donations? Do you get any grants, anything?
We get very little grants. We do not receive any state funding or federal funding. So we do receive some family foundation grants for programming. And we receive, but the majority of the donations are from across the country, to be honest with you. Just small donations that come in. We send out some mailers and try to reach out to them a couple times a year. And we're fortunate, that Alex keeps the story alive by going around the country speaking, just like his mom used to do years ago. So we have donors from all across the country, and but that is obviously the majority of our funding is from donors, from individual donors.
And I'll just take this opportunity, if anybody's listening, we can always use more donors, and we can make small donors into bigger donors, because we have a lot of plans for the future, and we want to be back here in 30 years to do the 60th anniversary with you, Bob.
Yeah, okay, I'd like to be here, but I don't know about that. This is a very basic question, but how old were your parents when they were in Auschwitz?
My mom was 10, and my dad, depending on what he lied about his age, he was 14 when the family was put into the ghetto. He was 18, 19 when he was liberated by Mr. Neff.
Okay, so I guess my question to that is, your mom was 10 years old. I don't know how much you ever talked to her about this or how much she would say, but when did she did she come out of there with this sense of forgiveness, or did she have to build that over time?
My mom, as somebody told me recently, my mom was probably the most unforgiving person who ever forgave ever. So she was not forgiving. She would have nightmares. Her first 5 years after liberation, she had nightmares until they finally got to Israel in 1950. And so, no, she was not a forgiving person. She went on her first flight to Germany after in the 80s or 90s. She had a panic attack at 30,000 feet because on the system they're given instructions in German. So, no, the way her path to forgiveness was all happenstance, and she met a Nazi doctor, and because of meeting Dr. Munch, that led her down this path of forgiveness. And so I think when I talk to people, I think it gave her another 24 years of life. I think it made her a healthier, happier person that could laugh more, and I think it really was a miracle that she found forgiveness.
2 minutes to go in the program today. I just want to give each of you a minute. I've said this before, we're in a very divisive time. What are the lessons that you would want people to take away from our discussion today? Troy?
Well, I would hope that they would, take the time to come to the museum at some point. Go to our website. We are here, to find out those lessons of Eva Kor. Find out more. Want to learn more. Come to Indiana's only Holocaust museum here in Terre Haute. I even have people from Terre Haute who say they haven't been to the museum or it's been a long time. We've tried our best here in the last few years to make it more interactive and more encouraging, and we've had a lot of students come through, which is great. So I would just encourage people to try to make it a day trip to Terre Haute and come to the museum at some point in time, because I do think they're going to learn a lot.
Okay, Alex, last minute.
If my mom were here today, she would tell here in the audience as well as your listeners, if everyone listening to this could think of one thing that they can do every morning to make the world a better place, the world will ultimately be a better place. And I think my mom always would say that she didn't want to be tolerated by people. She wanted to be respected. So I think the second part of that is to respect your coworkers, respect your teachers, respect your parents. And if we did those two simple things, I think we would have maybe less problems that we're dealing with now.
All right. Thank you very much. That was Dr. Alex Kor, the son of Eva and Mickey Kor, author of the book A Blessing, Not a Burden, which documents his parents' story. We've also been hearing from Troy Fears, the executive director of the Candles Museum. Thank you to everybody here at the Candles Museum for hosting us, and thank you to all of my colleagues from WFIU who have been here today, especially our producers, Bento Boutier and Pat Bean, our development team, and our engineer, Brock Hammond. I'm Bob Zaltzberg. Thanks for listening.